invite Grace down. And the title of this is Ectoplasm. I know a bit about Grace's work, so I think this is going to be quite fascinating. So.
Hello, my name is Grace, as everybody knows, and I'm an artist to begin with, and my research, my PhD, is practice-led. So it'll be slightly changed from perhaps some of the presentations that we've seen. But my working title is The Supernatural Sex, Women, Magic and Mediumship, Building a Field of Fascination in Contemporary Art. And my main focus is on a series of images that were taken in the 1920s of female mediums manifesting what was known as ectoplasm. Now, when I normally say ectoplasm, people usually think of Ghostbusters. It's the one reference point that everybody seems to have. But if we kind of look at the etymology of the word, ecto from ektos, the Greek, is external or distant, and plasma, is moulding. So it kind of brings in the idea of a sculptural materialisation that is kind of part of the images. The reason why I'm interested in it particularly is because there was often females who were involved in mediumship, and the idea of the female body as a vessel, and obviously the feminist context that is kind of read into that, and there's a disappearance of the actual medium herself, and then is kind of channeling this material substance. They're highly sexualised images. These are taken from an archive that I visited in the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg in Canada, which is a very unusual place if anybody's ever been there. But they're held, he was a practicing doctor, so a lot of the images, the documentation that you can see here, were photographically taken, but they were taken in a very scientific manner, or his kind of concept of a scientific process. And the ectoplasm itself would often exude from any available orifice of the body. So as I say, obviously highly sexualized in terms of it would often come from the vagina. So it also reads into the dark room of the seance, and the manipulation of a version of a male pimp who would often employ a female medium or young girls who obviously had no kind of psychic ability, and then push them into this kind of practice. It was kind of a higher level or a different level of a prostitution, basically. But the reason why I'm interested in terms of my practice is because there's a strong link between photography and the documentation of these images, and photography as an authenticator. You can see in this image that actually within the ectoplasm there are photographic forms, so there's 2D images. So it also brings in the idea of the spirit world communicating via photography, and the idea of photography perhaps being kind of cryptesthetic or giving a clear viewing to the audience. So this is the bank of cameras that was used by T.G. Hamilton, which this collection is from, and you can see how kind of heavily he was ladening the seance room, which was a very kind of small closed off room, to document the kind of manifestations that were supposedly happening. And he had several different cameras, but never a video camera, which obviously is an interesting concept because, I mean, video was very prevalent. This was in the 20s, so it wasn't like it was impossible to do. And then in my own art practice, I've often played with these images in terms of how we come to have a concept of the unseen. So, I mean, if I now said to ectoplasm to somebody, I would have a referential point of the images that I've seen of this. But for many of you who'd never seen it, if I asked you to describe ectoplasm, I would probably get a very vast array of craziness. So I'm interested in how we come to kind of have these ideas of the unseen and how we can kind of represent them and the problems that can encounter in terms of representation within photography. So here I was exploring using kind of paint marks and the gestural images of often the females that were in these seances. There's many descriptions of how they kind of react to certain circumstances. The gestural hands plays kind of into hysterical women, if people know Charcot's kind of images from the Salpêtrière Hospital. Massively kind of interesting images. But I mean, for artist practice, are kind of looking at people like Anne Barrable, who are interested in the idea of a paint mark over found photography and imagery, and how that can kind of ignite an image and make you read it in a slightly different way, which obviously in terms of the supernatural and supernatural photography is kind of a question point for me. But then, as I've said, this is often, or these images were often photographed, and they never played into film. So, I mean, I have a huge fascination with early cinema. people like the Lumiere brothers. I mean, this is a very beautiful early 1800s film called The Serpentine Dancer, which is a hand-tinted piece in which it's a very simple technique, but the idea of like an illusory effect with early film is something that played into my work. So also in relation to the earlier body of work that I showed you, I started to develop a piece of kind of found footage, because there is no film footage from the 1920s or even in the early Victorian kind of spiritualism era of women producing this material, because obviously it was perhaps too difficult for them to kind of manipulate at the time. But I'm interested in, as a kind of secondary part to this, the idea of the archive and how that can kind of strengthen or authenticate as a kind of a way of building narratives. So when anybody kind of interacts with an archive, how much you actually question how it's been put together or the processes behind it, and if that reads into any kind of narrative that perhaps you wouldn't have had if you just interacted with it in a specific way. So these were just some shots. I was recently in the New Art West Midlands show at Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, so this was a piece that was shown there. But then in terms of cultural or contemporary relevance, I've been looking at kind of how entrenched mediumship still is in society. If you think about the kind of television programmes, we have psychic TV networks. I mean, there's been lots in the paper recently around Sally Morgan being able to sue the Daily Mail because she, you know, for slander, but she's had to now kind of come out and say, you know, you can't sue me for slander, but they also can't state that she has psychic powers, because obviously everyone would think that was crazy. So I've been looking at artists who specifically work with the idea of this. So this is Christian Jankowska's piece. He's done several pieces based on this. This is Telemystica, in which he interacts with these kind of common tropes in the kind of in society, where the ideas of prediction, of chance, and the comfort that goes along with that. Because I mean, I'm not sure how many people in here have an interest in mediumship, whether you watch it for kind of entertainment purposes or whether you read horoscopes on the train, but it's very much there, and you perhaps are less aware of it, but people really kind of have a superstition, or they kind of play into that. So this was a piece of work that I did that was installed at the School of Art, and it was based on Sally Morgan, who's a kind of the leading contemporary medium of the time. I'm very interested in her because of the way that she performs to her audience. So she has a very kind of matronly look. She really kind of plays the mothering role, and the idea of the mother in terms of this kind of wider context of my research is quite important, because obviously ectoplasm is a form of birthing, and also the female body as a vessel or a channel all kind of plays into this. Again, referencing people who in contemporary art have a kind of strong link to the supernatural or an interest in it. So this is a piece of work called Witness by Susan Hiller. She's a very kind of established artist, playing on recordings of people who have supposedly had experiences with either UFO sightings or supernatural kind of entities. And the audience kind of moves through the space. They're installed. They're very theatrical, which is quite important in my work as well, as it develops. So you can see here that the audience is free to walk around through the work and then listen to each story. And this is perhaps the most famous of her pieces, and this is Psy Girl, so referencing found footage from modern cinema of young girls with psychokinetic power. So there's always that link. I'm kind of questioning the role of women in the supernatural and how they have come to kind of have this strong link, and how we can question that in terms of breaking down ideas of reappropriation. So it was often used in terms of or in a derogatory sense as women closer to, closer to nature, being kind of erratic, being irrational, having beliefs in the supernatural itself, witchcraft obviously, and how all of this has been then used in later stages through film, through people like Sally Morgan, to develop a certain different strength towards a reappropriation of it. So these are just some images of my own practice as it's kind of developing. These are slightly kind of newer, playing on the idea of ectoplasm being produced from the fingertips, which is obviously, in terms of physical making, is something that I'm quite interested in. So you can kind of see here that they're based on photographs that I've taken, and then they're digitally manipulated. But to bring you kind of bang up to date where I am at the moment, so this will be the most confused section. This was an image that I found massively inspiring from the collections that I've been looking at, in which the ectoplasm took the form of a supernormal scarf, and this is actually how they described it. But the fact that it's completely covering the medium's head, and that it has ideas of kind of fetish and covering of the face, a masking and a gagging really, kind of all plays into this idea of kind of masking the body, the female body, and how that can be read in terms of, you know, women as being less kind of, well, as women being deemed as less important, or that they have a certain vanishing point within the dark room of the seance. I'll skip through these, but these are certain images that, yes, I'll leave it there. Thank you.